Welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 255 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. In this episode, I'm going to talk about unhelpful thinking. And unhelpful thinking is something that is rife amongst, everyone I speak to, including leaders and especially thoughtful leaders, because we are quite thoughtful individuals who are quite introspective. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about ways to reduce that unhelpful thinking and make it more useful. So let's get into this episode right now. Something I've noticed about thoughtful leaders I work with is that they can fall prey to unhelpful thinking. Now, you might say that everyone has a tendency to do this, but I do find that thoughtful leaders are often more introspective and may have a tendency to get wrapped up in unhelpful thoughts. Of course, the thoughts that people most often become wrapped up in are negative thoughts, the ones that assault us throughout the day and deep into the night. Things like, I'm a failure, I can't believe I did that, how stupid am I should have said something else instead. So we are wired to focus on negative experiences more than positive ones, and I'll leave a link in the show notes page about that. So these sort of negative thoughts are the ones that stay with us. And there's a related article I'd recommend as well about overthinking things, how thoughtful leaders can stop it. And you can find all the show note links in the page this week. thoughtfulleader.com/255 is where to go. So rumination is one form of unhelpful thinking, and psychology professor Edward Watkins describes rumination as repetitive, prolonged, and recurrent negative thinking about oneself, feelings, personal concerns, and upsetting experiences. According to Professor Watkins and his colleague Henrietta Roberts, rumination can have a number of negative effects, including magnifying negative moods, potentially exacerbating several mental health conditions such as anxiety, and also maintaining our physiological stress responses. In other words, keeping you feeling stressed for longer. Now, in my own words, this unhelpful thinking can mean that we feel bad about ourselves for a long period of time, be more prone to mental health problems, and also feel the ongoing impact of stress long after the original negative event is over. And for leaders, it's obviously important to try to reduce this type of thinking. After all, having a negative voice inside your head will likely make you feel a whole lot less confident about what you're doing. Now, over the years, I've become increasingly interested in the thinking part of leadership, including what helps and what doesn't. And personally, I'm very introspective by nature. I find this to be a valuable trait in making sense of events and emotions, but it can definitely go too far. Especially in my younger years, I would often find myself caught in this rumination trap, thinking negative thoughts over and over and experiencing negative events time and time again. Now, I call this unhelpful thinking because it doesn't really get us anywhere. It just makes us feel bad about ourselves. It reduces confidence, makes us feel miserable, and does not include any practical steps to get us to a better place. Now, I used to think that I could think through my problems, and to some extent I still believe this is true, but we really need to take a coaching approach to make this happen. Simply thinking about a situation more and more does not necessarily help us. And when I say coaching approach, I mean acknowledging our current situation, but then also asking ourselves, so what are you going to do about it? And then moving on to try to take some sort of constructive action. So now I'm going to suggest some research-backed approaches that you can try to reduce this unhelpful thinking and start taking action instead. And before we move on with that though, there is a recommended article from my website as well, Worrying About Work, Tips for Thoughtful Leaders. You can check that out as well on the show notes page. Now, the first tip I would recommend is to use psychological distancing to stop unhelpful thinking. So what is this thing? Well, it's a concept that's quite simple and can be powerful. The authors Orwell, Cross, and Gelman discuss psychological distancing through the use of the word you when reflecting on our own experiences. So when reflecting on a past event, instead of speaking to yourself in the first person, so you're saying I did this, I did that, you refer to yourself in the third person instead, such as by using you, they, or your first name. So, for example, instead of saying, I could have said no to taking on more work, you would say, you could have said no to taking on more work. Or you might say, Ben could have said no to taking on more work. Now, this does a few interesting things. First, it tends to reduce your emotional investment in the situation because it references your contribution from an outsider, impartial perspective. Secondly, the use of you or they broadens the context to include a greater group of people. So when you say I, the focus is quite narrow. It's just you, and you can sort of get consumed on the fact that, oh, it's just me that has this problem. But when you refer to yourself in the third person, it generalizes the situation as if this could apply to many other people too, not just you. It's a simple reframe that can be used when simply sitting and thinking by yourself or through an activity such as journaling. When I first read about this, I was surprised to realize that I naturally tend to do this automatically. I talk to myself as if I'm having a conversation with myself, so that can be a useful way to do it, and you can do it too. The second thing I recommend is to try a technique called temporal distancing, which can help to reduce unhelpful thinking. Now, this one is a little bit different, but it also works to reduce the stress of this unhelpful thinking process. Now, in the paper, This Too Shall Pass, Temporal Distance and the Regulation of Emotional Distress, the authors discussed this concept as a way to reduce the emotional impact from reflecting on negative events. And as usual, these are all in the show notes page, these links to these papers, thoughtfleader.com/255. Now, the word temporal refers to time. So it's no surprise that this technique involves reflecting on a situation from a distant future perspective. So in other words, we may reflect on a recent negative event from a far distant future, such as 5 or 10 years from now. And you could use this in a reflective question such as, how will this situation feel 10 years from now? And in many cases, time heals all wounds. So embarrassing yourself in front of the CEO may feel terrible today, but it's likely to be a far less significant event if you consider it from 10 years down the track. I've also seen a similar concept used by consultants in what I've heard called backcasting. This is where you start from a point 5 years into the future and think back to the present, and you brainstorm backwards, including all the steps it would take to get from a positive future back to the current reality. This approach can have the effect of minimizing any pessimistic thoughts from the current reality and instead taking a more optimistic future-focused perspective. So that question was, how will this situation feel 10 years from now or 5 years from now or even 3 weeks from now? That can be a way to put things in perspective and help you gain a bit of perspective about how bad this situation really is. The third technique I'd recommend is something called perspective broadening. And this is something I often use with coaching clients. This is discussed in a paper by Travers Hill, Dunn, Hoppert, Hitchcock, and Dalgleish, specifically with reference to people with a history of recurrent depression. Now, note that the ideas in this episode are not treatment for mental health disorders, but I still find this a useful tool personally and for coaching. Now, in a similar vein to psychological distancing, this technique aims to widen our perspective of a negative circumstance, so we aren't just thinking about it from a personal standpoint. Now, the authors suggest doing this through the use of reflective questions such as, what would you say to someone else who is experiencing this situation? I was recently coaching someone who is prone to putting their own needs on the back burner, instead focusing on everybody else. Now, while this type of helpfulness can seem like an admirable trait, it often has its drawbacks. My client was feeling stressed and overwhelmed with their workload, so I asked them the question, if your colleague was experiencing this, what advice would you give them? And their advice was, well, to look after themselves as their top priority. So then the conversation started to move in a different direction as it went into, well, why wasn't this person following their own good advice that they would give to a colleague? So perspective broadening could be used during your own personal introspection or as part of reflective activities such as journaling. Now, I'm currently working on a paper journal called the Useful Thinking Journal, which incorporates these techniques as part of the journaling process in an aim to help people reflect better through a structured process. And I'll have more information as I go along. It's not quite ready yet, but it is getting close. Now, I enjoy techniques like these because they're very simple, practical, and within our control, and they're research-based as well. Now, if we can reduce the mental stress involved in this rumination, we're likely to be able to think more clearly and respond in a way that we'll be proud of, rather than reacting in an emotionally charged manner. And you could also use these types of techniques as part of a team, reflecting back on a difficult project or some sort of failure that the team has experienced, for example. So try them for yourself and see if they make a difference for you. They can be really useful at getting you to process the event and actually let go of it so you can free your mind to think about something else. So I'm interested in your ideas though. What do you personally do to reduce unhelpful thinking that can sometimes derail your leadership? Let me and all the other Thoughtful Leaders know in the comments on the show notes page, and that is at thoughtfulleader.com/255. And once again, if you like this podcast, I'd really appreciate you leaving a positive review on your podcast app of choice. It helps me get the word out about the podcast and spread the word about thoughtful leadership. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I'll be back next time.